Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Baker Institute, and thank you all for your support. You are in for a fantastic evening tonight, ladies and gentlemen, and I can say that with great confidence because I have worked closely with both men who will take part in tonight's discussion. I would say to you without reservation, they are two of the finest diplomats to ever serve our country. But more importantly, both are quality human beings who have the traits that we teach our children, traits like loyalty and honesty and patriotism and determination. And so it has been my pleasure to call each one of them my colleague as well as my friend. Ed DeRidgen, of course, helped found the Baker Institute. For 25 years, he and his wife, Francoise, have elevated it from obscurity to become recognized as the third best university-affiliated think tank in the world, according to the think tank ratings recently promulgated. We're fortunate that Ed left a successful career in the State Department, where he was serving as our country's ambassador to Israel and had been ambassador to Syria and also Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, and then came to Houston. When I first met Bill Burns, I was younger than he is today. Now, I'm not sure whether that's a comment on how old I am, which is true, or how young he still is. It's probably a comment on both. But it does give a sense of how much time has passed since he became Deputy Secretary of the State Department's, Deputy of the State Department's Policy Planning Staff when I was Secretary of State in 1989. After I left state in 1992, our Speaker, a career Foreign Service officer, would stay, serving as our ambassador to Jordan and then to Russia, and as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, and finally as Deputy Secretary of State, the #2 position in the State Department. On retirement, he became president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a position he still holds. I watched his extraordinary career with admiration, and I really can't say that I was surprised by his success, because that's, quite frankly, because he is one of the finest U.S. diplomats of his generation. Early in my tenure at State, I learned that he was someone I could trust, whether the issue was forging an international coalition to reverse Iraq's aggression against Kuwait, whether it was organizing the Madrid Peace Conference between Israel and its Arab neighbors, or whether it was brokering the peaceful reunification of Germany. He contributed a wise and sober voice. Our Speaker possesses that most precious of qualities in the conduct of foreign affairs, the ability to formulate strategic goals, and then the ability to execute pragmatic policies to advance those goals. Both gifts are on display in his book, The Back Channel, which provides a unique view of both broad geopolitical trends and a sense of the day-to-day texture of foreign policy. The Back Channel also says a lot of really nice things about me. So you have to take this introduction with a little bit of a grain of salt. But I want to say that our Speaker really is living evidence of the old adage, nice guys finish last, that old adage is false. He's living evidence of that. He's a person of high character. He's honest, he's humble, he's loyal, he's courteous, and he's immensely patriotic. Everywhere he has worked, he has left a trail of dedicated fans behind him. And as you can tell from what I've said so far, I'm one of those fans. And so, ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor and pleasure to introduce the Honorable William J. Burns and our outstanding Institute Director, the Honorable Edward P. DeRidgen.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Secretary. Well, Bill, who would have ever thought we'd wind up having a conversation with our former boss right there in the audience, and after so many years. Bill started out his career in the embassy in Amman as a consular officer, probably our lowest ranking Foreign Service officer there.
Not probably, I was.
He was the lowest ranking. And I was the deputy chief of mission. So there was a generational difference there, but we spotted him early on as a tremendously potential high riser. He used to play basketball with our son Gregory in the embassy in Amman, and we became like family, and he got married to Lisa in Amman. And in his book, which is a terrific book, by the way, it's a book that makes a major contribution to the role of the Foreign Service officer in diplomacy. And Bill represents perhaps one of the most successful, if not the most successful, career officer who rose from being a modest consular officer in Amman to be Deputy Secretary of State, and also, I'll mention a little while, even a higher position for 24 hours. When he joined the Foreign Service, in his first chapter of his book, he talked about the relatively homogeneous nature of the Foreign Service in the early 1980s as pale, male, and Yale.
I was 2 out of 3.
Little does he realize, when I joined the Foreign Service in the 60s, being an Armenian was even more challenging. So, also the characterization that you learned early on of Middle East policy and the challenges American diplomats face is the myth of Sisyphus, of rolling that stone up the hill. You make progress, and the damn stone finally rolls back over you, is a very apt analogy. But Bill, I've got to ask you, you rose to the very top, and then you were named Acting Secretary of State from January 20th, 2009 to January 21st, 2009, during the transition from President George W. Bush to President Obama. What the hell did you do in those 24 hours? Did you give yourself a pay raise?
No.
Did you give yourself a promotion? Or what did you do?
Very little, actually, for those 24 hours. But yeah. No, I should say at the outset, as a recovering diplomat now, because I retired 4 years ago, I do owe a huge debt of gratitude to 2 people in this room. To the gentleman to my right on the stage who, as Ed was suggesting, when I was a very junior diplomat, set a wonderful example as an extraordinary career diplomat, and inspired me in many ways to spend a lot of my career in the Middle East and in Russia. And second, of course, to Secretary Baker. You know, I served proudly administrations of both parties over 3.5 decades. I served 10 secretaries of state and 5 presidents, but nowhere in that experience did I see a group of American leaders exercise American power and diplomacy more effectively than I saw in the George H.W. Bush administration when I worked for Secretary Baker. Nor did I ever see a better negotiator on behalf of American interests than I saw in Secretary Baker. So I didn't always get everything right in the next 3 decades, but I never forgot the example and the lessons that I learned from both of you.
Thank you. Talking about your work for Secretary Baker, your second chapter in the book about the Baker years in shaping order and the Bush administration's diplomacy across the board, you talk about how carefully James A. Baker III would approach problems, and the 5 Ps, which are?
I remember too, I mean, preparation and persistence.
Prior preparation prevents poor performance, but in Texas, the secretary adds a 6th P. Prior preparation prevents piss poor performance. And
that works in Washington too.
So under the Baker Department of State, I caught one thing in your book is, first of all, Secretary Baker's relationship with Gorbachev and Shevardnadze, which you want to talk about that, how you assess that personal relationship and the consequences of that.
Sure. Well, I mean, you know, that period, the end of the Cold War, as the Secretary knows better than anyone, was one of those plastic moments in the history of the international landscape that comes along very rarely, maybe a couple times a century. We saw it in 1945, you know, after the Second World War, and we saw it in 1989, and I would argue we're seeing it again today. What we saw in the late 1940s and then after 1989 was an intersection with a group of American leaders who understood the landscape in front of them and the profound transformations that were taking place, had a sense of strategic purpose, I think, understood that this moment of singular American dominance after the end of the Cold War wasn't going to be a permanent condition, and that you had to try to shape order that would outlast that moment. They also had a sense of strategic empathy, which gets to your point, I think, about Gorbachev and Shevardnadze. It's fashionable in Washington today to talk about restoring swagger to American diplomacy. I didn't see much swagger in that era at a moment when, by any rational measure of American power, we could have swaggered a lot. But you didn't see President Bush 41 or Secretary Baker spiking the football on top of the Berlin Wall at the end of the Cold War, where there was a sense of empathy about the predicament of Mikhail Gorbachev and Edward Shevardnadze, the world they were dealing with, and the importance of treating that, I think, with a fair amount of understanding and dexterity. And, I learned a lot from that period. There's the old Vince Lombardi story where he had a young halfback, this is in the 1960s, playing for the Green Bay Packers, who scored his first touchdown and did a dance in the end zone. And Lombardi called him over afterwards and said, "Young man, next time you do that, act like you've been there before." Well, Secretary Baker and President Bush 41 always acted like they'd been there before. And there was, and it was a lesson to me in how you manage complicated periods and the importance of personal relationships, which is not the same as the sort of narcissism that you see today, in which you think that personal relationships are the only way in which you can conduct international relations. They were personal relationships, heavily invested in and nurtured, but coupled with the serious, head down, day in, day out, systematic approach to diplomacy.
It makes a big difference.
It does, yeah, it does, and that's the way you get things done. Even though at that moment the United States had far more leverage in many respects than it does today, we're no longer the only big kid on the geopolitical block. But the lesson, I think, is as relevant today as it was in that era.
You also mentioned that this is one of the hypothetical ifs of history, that if Bush 41 had not lost the election in '92, and we know how close we were to an Israeli-Syrian peace agreement, that Baker would have gone immediately into a shuttle diplomacy, and we most probably could have brought that home.
Yeah, I think the Middle East, again, as you know well, Ed, is, always a part of the world where pessimists feel right at home, and moments rarely emerge where you have intersection of the right leaders and the right moment on the landscape, and I think that was one of them. So actually, I think I said in the book, I believe to this day that there would have been a Syrian-Israeli agreement in the early 1990s. There might have been a Palestinian-Israeli agreement as well. But those moments come and go. And, so it's another of those what ifs. What if Yitzhak Rabin hadn't been, assassinated at the end of 1995?
That was a major factor.
But those intersections come along. You learn over time in diplomacy that those intersections can be quite fleeting, and you need to take advantage of them.
We lose momentum at times.
We do.
And when you lose momentum, bad things can happen, especially in the Middle East.
Yeah, it's true. But the trick, the real gift, I think, is to appreciate that moment at the time. Because, all of us are so much smarter, I've noticed, after we leave government. Everything looks so clear in hindsight.
Right.
But I always thought, the capacity to appreciate in that period both moments where you had to take calculated risks. And anybody who thinks that the process of reunifying Germany, and keeping it in NATO within a year after the collapse of the Berlin Wall was foreordained and inevitable, didn't live through that period. That took enormous dexterity, a willingness to take some calculated risks, just like putting together the Desert Storm Coalition did, just like the Madrid Peace Conference did. But you got to couple that with an appreciation of the importance of restraint at other moments. It would have been, in some respects, militarily the easiest thing in the world to have pursued Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi military from the Kuwaiti-Iraq border in the spring of 1991 all the way to Baghdad. It was the right choice not to do that.
Definitely. In your chapter 5, The Age of Terror, the Inversion of Force and Diplomacy, you served with Colin Powell and Rich Armitage during the Iraq War, and you stated in the book, "We worried that an ill-considered unilateral war to topple Saddam would prove to be a massive foreign policy blunder," which indeed did occur. Mm-hmm. But I noticed in the book that you and Colin Powell, you were sort of like holding back a little. You forcefully put your case before them, but did you just sense that it was like rolling the rock of Sisyphus up there, that the decision had already been made by the so-called neocons to invade?
Well, I think that was, as I mentioned in the book, sort of the most painful experience I had in 3.5 decades in government, in part because we spent more time arguing with each other in Washington in that era than we did arguing with people in the Middle East sometimes. In a disciplined service like the Foreign Service or like the U.S. military, your obligation is not only to implement policies that, are decisions that are made by political leaders, but it's also, you have an equal obligation to be honest about your concerns. Within the discipline of the system, you can resign. I had enormous respect for the 3 State Department colleagues who resigned over the war in Iraq in 2003. There were about 20 in the early 90s over the Balkans. There are even more in the last couple of years. I think it can also be an honorable choice to continue to operate within a system, but you have to be honest. And so, a couple of colleagues of mine, including Ryan Crocker, who was working with me in the Near East Bureau then, a wonderful diplomat, had the most depressing brainstorming session of our careers one afternoon in the summer of 2002, where we tried to list all the things that we thought could go wrong on the day after Saddam Hussein was toppled. We got to 14 single-space pages and entitled this The Perfect Storm and sent it to Secretary Powell. I got it declassified. You can read it today. It's a very imperfect effort to list all of our concerns. We got it about half right and half wrong. It's more a kind of hurried list of horribles than it is a coherent analysis or set of arguments. But what we were trying to do was puncture the recklessly rosy assumptions of lots of the advocates for war. I always thought, and I do not mean for a moment to demean the military difficulty of any kind of effort, including Iraq in 2003, but I always thought the easier part was going to be to topple Saddam Hussein. The hard part was always going to be what happened the day after. My generation of Foreign Service officers, especially people who were Middle East specialists, was seared by the experience of Lebanon in the 1980s, right, when we stumbled into a sectarian conflict which we had no business stumbling into. And that's exactly what Ryan and others and I were worried about then. But the problem is you always end up feeling like an enabler in situations like that, even if you're honest within the system. So to this day, I'm not sure I made the right choice in that era. But I will say we tried to be as honest as we could be.
And that's very important. You were on the inside at that time. We were on the outside. The Baker Institute and the CFR, we did a joint little report, and we went to Washington and gave it to Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz, and basically 2 major recommendations was, if we're going to go to war, this was published in January, we went to war in March, so it wasn't hindsight, that if we do go to war, don't dismantle the Iraqi military. Right. Get rid of the goons at the top, but keep it there or else we're going to have to assume it. And don't dismantle the Ba'ath Party, both of which they listened to and totally ignored. And I got to tell you, it's one of the worst feelings you have. You guys were on the inside, and we were on the outside, but the leadership of our government simply did not take these factors into consideration.
Well, and the process had broken down too. I mean, even those two decisions you meant about the dissolution of the Iraqi armed forces and, effectively banning people who had been Ba'ath Party members from public service in Iraq. And the truth is, there were a lot of school teachers in Iraq who'd become Ba'ath Party members, sort of like Communist Party members in the old Soviet Union, because that was the only way to get ahead and get a job. And so you immediately ensured, when those choices were made in a very haphazard way, that you were going to have a Sunni Arab insurgency, because you had a lot of aggrieved people out there. And that was yet another of the series of mistakes that we made in that period.
And I don't know how many people understand that ISIS, many years later, that the command and control of ISIS are former Ba'ath Party members and former Ba'ath military officers. So again, the unintended consequences of these decisions we make come back to haunt us. Your chapter 3 on Yeltsin, it's terrific, the career you took from being an Arabist and going and taking Russian studies.
Someone else I know.
Yeah, we had a discussion whether you should do that. I remember you calling me and saying, Ed, should I break ranks for a little while and go to Russia? And then you became ambassador to Russia, which you called your dream job.
Yeah, I mean, in hindsight, I'm not so sure that was the case. But
well, that's what
most
you're saying.
Of my gray hair came from dealing with Russians, not the Middle East, I think. But,
right.
Yeah.
But you did break the mold, I think, to your credit, and went into another expertise, which I think just enhanced your value to the Foreign Service. But there's also, you're infamous for being quoted in a WikiLeaks cable on a Caucasian wedding you went to, which we don't have time for you to get into, but it sounds like a hell of a party with a lot of vodka and a lot of caviar and things that you sent back. New York Times really focused in on that. Tell me, in the you say in the book, in this chapter, in the end, there proved to be no avoiding the sense of loss and humiliation that came with the defeat in the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. There was bound to come a moment when Russia would have the capacity to toss off the junior partner role that made it so uncomfortable, even as its long-term great power decline continued. Can you elaborate on that? Because I think it's an excellent analysis of personified by Putin, who's trying to resurrect some sort of role in a post-Soviet Union period.
Well, start with Putin. I mean, I vividly remember my first meeting as the newly arrived U.S. ambassador in Moscow with Vladimir Putin. The first meeting took place in the Kremlin, and as many of you know, the Kremlin is built on a scale that's meant to intimidate visitors, especially newly arrived American ambassadors. So you walk through these huge ornate halls, down long corridors. You come at the end of one huge hall, there are these two-story bronze doors, and you're kept waiting there for a minute just to let all this sink in. And then the door opens a crack, and out comes President Putin, who, despite his bare-chested persona, is not that intimidating in the flesh. He's about 5'6", but he carries himself with great self-assurance. So he comes walking through the door, looking straight in my eyes, which is his habit. And before I got a word out of my mouth, let alone handed over the letter I had from President George W. Bush, he said, "You Americans need to listen more. You can't have everything your own way anymore. We can have effective relations, but not just on your terms." In my experience, that was vintage Vladimir Putin. It was not subtle. It was almost defiantly charmless. But it conveyed a very candid message, which was you can't take advantage of Russia anymore. Because I've always thought if you want to understand the smoldering aggressiveness of Vladimir Putin's Russia, it helps to have understood the disorder and the chaos of Boris Yeltsin's Russia. When I first served in the embassy in Moscow as the political chief, the head of the political section in the early 1990s, that was a Russia that was chaotic, across 11 time zones. And traveling around Russia in that period gave you a vivid sense of the humiliation that a lot of Russians felt, alongside the sense of hope that came with the end of communism. I remember in the first Chechen war, in the winter of 1994-95, going to Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, which is an isolated part of Russia in the North Caucasus. 40 square blocks in the middle of that capital were flattened. They looked like photographs you saw of Dresden in 1945. The Russian general who had accomplished this said that his purpose was to make the rubble bounce. Most of the civilians killed there were elderly ethnic Russians who couldn't escape. But I remember driving into Grozny from the neighboring Russian Republic, and here was the Red Army that at the height of the Cold War was supposed to be able to get to the English Channel in 48 hours, that looked more like a street gang. Now, albeit a street gang with nuclear weapons. But, but this was a far cry from the height of Soviet power, at least what Soviets wanted us to believe. So you had to understand that to understand the worldview of someone like Vladimir Putin. He drew a straight line from the humiliation of the 90s as he saw it, when he thought the United States took advantage of Russia's moment of historical disadvantage, through the color revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine in 2003, 2004, right, through the spring of 2008, when, as we were discussing before, I think we left NATO expansion on autopilot and pushed for the formal opening of the door to membership in NATO for Ukraine and Georgia, which I hate the term red line, but it was the reddest of red lines for even the most progressive critics of Putin in Moscow. And I remember, another anecdote about Putin. Condi Rice was the Secretary of State. I was the ambassador in the fall of 2006, and so the secretary came to Moscow. We went out to meet with Putin in his dacha out in the forests beyond Moscow, and had a reasonably congenial dinner, talked about lots of issues. After dinner, we're sitting having coffee in front of this roaring fireplace in an anteroom. And the secretary firmly but politely told Putin that he should be sure to be restrained in dealing with Georgia, whose leader then was a guy named Mikhail Saakashvili. Russians expect weaker neighbors to be deferential, and Saakashvili was passionately undeferential. But the secretary's message was a reasonable one, but this animated Putin, so he stands up in front of the fireplace and and he prides himself on his control, but he was getting genuinely angry. So he's wagging his finger in the secretary's face, saying, in effect, you Americans are the puppeteers, Saakashvili is your puppet, you need to pull back on the strings, because if he starts something, we're going to finish it. The secretary, to her credit, stood up in front of Putin. Now, she was in her heels, so she's about 5 or 6 inches taller than him in her heels, which did not improve his disposition much. The conversation de-escalated eventually, but Russia-Georgia relations didn't, and in August of 2008, Putin baited Saakashvili, and then Russia invaded Georgia. So, and then you keep drawing that straight line, this is my last point, all the way to our elections in 2016. Yeah. Putin's conviction is we took advantage of Russia's moment of historical weakness. He saw polarization and dysfunction in our political system. He saw an opportunity to take advantage of that, which he did, and succeeded beyond his wildest imagination. But my point is simply that, in order to understand Putin's aggressiveness today, it helps to have understood how things have evolved over the last 25 years. I'm not trying to suggest that, as the debate ran in the late 1990s about who lost Russia, Russia it's the wrong question in some ways to direct to Americans. Russia was never ours to lose. It was Russians had to shape post-Soviet Russia. But I think it's a tangled history with illusions on both sides, ours and theirs, over that time.
You intimated in your book that Putin feared Bush 43's democracy promotion, as basically that the agenda was he was highly suspicious of that and how it would impact on Russia.
Well, Putin, psychologists would call this projection, so he's always assumed that, people were trying to manipulate Russian politics. I remember seeing him in another meeting, I think it was in 2007, it was just before parliamentary elections in Russia, Duma elections, And, as any embassy in the world, especially really big ones like our embassy in Moscow did, we had officers out all over the country just trying to better understand, the sort of politics of Russia. We weren't trying to put our thumb on the scale in favor of different candidates. Putin saw this as an effort to subvert the Russian political system. I remember him taking me aside, and I, as directly as I could, explained that we were doing just what diplomats get paid to do. We weren't trying to take sides. And he I remember, sort of half smirked and pushed that argument aside and said, just don't think we won't retaliate, if you interfere in our politics, which you fast forward a decade and it was kind of eerily prescient. But
how do you assess his taking over Crimea? That was really a bold move, and then all the pressure now on Ukraine.
Yeah, I don't think there are those who think that Putin had this kind of grand strategy where annexation of Crimea was something he'd been planning for some time. I'm not so sure of that. I was actually leading the U.S. delegation to the closing ceremony of the Sochi Winter Olympics when, the Ukraine crisis came to a head and President Yanukovych fled the scene in Kiev. And Putin had always had a very dim view of Yanukovych, who, was close to the Kremlin, but Putin thought he was weak, and that the way to have, put down the protesters in the Maidan in the central square in Kiev was just to shoot 24 of them, and that's what he would have done. But when Yanukovych fled, I think Putin was actually surprised, and he reacted in the only way that he knew how to, given what he saw to be a fundamental challenge to Russian influence, because it's hard for Russians to see themselves as a major power unless they're playing a predominant role in Ukraine, especially. And so he annexed Crimea and violated a pretty important norm of how the international system should work. Big countries don't get to swallow up parts of small countries just because they can. But for Putin, if the best case was a deferential government in Ukraine, next best was a dysfunctional Ukraine. So you annex Crimea, you invade southeastern Ukraine, the Donbass, and you sow as much chaos and insecurity as you can.
How do you assess the enlargement of NATO and how much of a factor that was in Putin's worldview and the policies he took? I mean, Gorbachev, Putin, the enlargement of NATO became a threat to them.
Well, I mean, it evolved, as you know, in several phases. I think in hindsight, again, we could have taken our time a little bit more about the first phase of expansion in Poland and Central and Eastern Europe, then the next phase in the Baltic countries. I was sitting in the embassy in Moscow as the political chief in the early 1990s. We argued that, you shouldn't underestimate the Russian reaction to that. It would have made sense, as Secretary Baker argued publicly at the time, to make a more serious test of whether or not the potential for Russian membership in NATO or some kind of a modified European security architecture in which they were more fully a part would have made sense to try that at the time. The Secretary of Defense in that period, Bill Perry, had launched a really creative idea called Partnership for Peace, which was meant to build greater confidence between the old Warsaw Pact countries and NATO countries. We might have played that out a little longer. But the truth is, if I were sitting in the embassy in Warsaw in that period, I would have also have argued the historical insecurities of Poles caught between the ambitions of Germans and Russians. So I don't think, the short answer is, I don't think that those first two waves of NATO expansion did lethal damage to the U.S.-Russia relationship. I do think we made a mistake, as I suggested earlier, in the spring of 2008, when we pushed for Ukrainian and Georgian membership.
You mentioned in the book that Putin plays a relatively weak hand very skillfully.
Putin said that publicly with a certain glee. Yeah.
Did he say that publicly?
Yeah, and then he said, and those, meaning us, and there are those who have stronger hands who play them weakly. That's not my fault.
Right.
He can be quite snarky when he wants to be.
But playing a weak hand skillfully, good, fine. That he can take some pride in, but what's your assessment of Russia today? Because its economy is quite weak, and they have their demographic problems. How much can he project power with a weak hand?
I mean, I think the historical critique of Putin is going to be pretty biting because, okay, even if you look at the case of Ukraine, he swallowed up a couple of million people in Crimea, but he's ensured that the other 42 million Ukrainians never again want to accept a predominant Russian role over Ukraine. He made a bet. You know, when I was ambassador a decade ago and he was surfing on $130 a barrel oil, that was a moment when he could have started to diversify the economy. Because Russia, even today, has hugely impressive human capital. Much of that human capital is now working in Silicon Valley now. But he could have diversified the economy in a much more serious way. He chose consciously not to, because it would have come at the expense of his priority, which is political control. Yeah. And where you lubricate the political system with corruption and with, you know, a control of the commanding heights of the economy. I also think that, so I think that where that leaves us in terms of US-Russian relations, looking not just at this administration, but beyond it, as long as Putin is the central decision maker in Russia, is a pretty narrow band of possibilities, from the sharply competitive to the nastily adversarial. But I also think that while it's important not to give in to Putin's aggressiveness, it's also important not to give up on the Russia beyond Putin. It's going to be a significant player with all of its economic and demographic problems, many of them self-inflicted. President Obama, for whom I have very high regard, said a few years ago, kind of dismissively of Russia, that it's just a regional power. And my reaction at the time was, it's a pretty goddamn big region, you know, across 11 time zones. And you need to take that into account. I also think there's a reality that just as Russians chafed at being the junior partner of the United States after the end of the Cold War, they're going to chafe at being China's junior partner as you look out over the next decade. So there's space for artful American diplomacy there, but we just need to be careful not to have a lot of illusions about what's possible in the short term. But we also got to be careful, this is the last point I'd make about this, that you keep some guardrails in the relationship, because that's the essence of diplomacy. Even in the most adversarial relationships, you need guardrails. And we're about to witness the collapse of what's left of the old arms control architecture between the United States and Russia. Even in the worst of the Cold War, we managed to reach agreements with the Soviets, and then after the Cold War with the Russians. Really the only thing left now, because the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty is about to expire or die on the vine, and the Russians violated it, so there's reason for that. But the New START agreement negotiated in the Obama administration, which reduced and regulates strategic nuclear weapons, expires at the beginning of 2021. And there's no real evidence right now on either side that there's a serious effort to extend that. And I think that's a big mistake.
You mentioned President Obama in your Chapter 7 entitled Obama's Long Game Bets, Pivots, and Resets in a Post-Primacy World. That's a hell of a subtitle there.
Kind of long.
But you said the strengths and the weaknesses of Obama's foreign policy, particularly the weakness in Obama not following through with his vision for a renewed relationship between the U.S. and the Middle East. I mean, his June 4th, 2009 speech in Cairo was quite a significant speech. I think, you know, you and I have been involved in that, and a lot of the themes that we had been advocating in the State Department, he enunciated, but then there was no real follow-up.
Well, I mean, I think there was follow-up, but I mean, it's the classic challenge of having I thought, very sensible long game, right. You know, a vision for the Middle East, which was not, he was criticized for wanting to disengage from the Middle East. I actually thought what President Obama was about was trying to change the terms of engagement between the United States and the Middle East. You know, to try to move away from what had become an over-militarized, you know, American engagement in the Middle East, to relatively greater emphasis on diplomacy, on focusing on some of the deeper drivers of dysfunction, especially in the Arab world, what eventually produced the Arab Spring, you know, the absence of economic opportunity, political opportunity, a sense of dignity, and then also to look at where American diplomacy could make a difference. You know, on some unresolved regional conflicts, including the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, including the challenge of Iran's nuclear program. So I think in terms of the long game, made sense. I think the problem was it intersected with the short game, as diplomacy always does. And you know, there's the former British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, who half a century ago was asked, you know, what defines and shapes successful statesmen? And he said, events, dear boy, events. And there's a lot of truth in that, because it's events and how you respond to them and how you anticipate their consequences. And I think when the Arab Spring came at the beginning of 2011, you know, many of us, you know, who had served in the Middle East could foresee the challenges that were coming to societies that were corrupt and unresponsive to their people. But the pace of change and its scope was really hard to take in that period. And so we got some things right and some things wrong in that period. I think in Egypt, you know, for all the criticism from some of our Gulf Arab friends that we had thrown Hosni Mubarak, the president of Egypt, under the bus, the truth is the bus was halfway across his prone political body when President Obama pronounced himself. I mean, and it was, you know, Mubarak, whom I had known for years, Secretary Baker, and you had, Ed, you know, just responded with too little too late to what was a building frustration on the part of his own people. So I don't think we could have played that hand a lot differently. In Libya and Syria, we made some mistakes. In Libya, again, if you put yourself back in President Obama's position, you know, in 2011, it would have been hard not to respond militarily in that period. I mean, the realities were, you know, Gaddafi was bent, I think, on, you know, a huge path of destruction to Benghazi, the biggest city in eastern Libya. I had dealt with Gaddafi in another set of back-channel talks right after 9/11 when we persuaded Gaddafi to get out of the business of terrorism and give up what was a rudimentary nuclear program. I've never dealt with a more peculiar foreign leader than Gaddafi. And
you got to tell us a little about that.
Well, his favorite time for meeting was about 3 o'clock in the morning out in the middle of the desert, which was not my prime time for conversations. And I remember one instance where, you know, we met out in the middle of the desert near Sirte, his hometown. So I see him in this tent, which, you know, he furnishes with basically white plastic lawn furniture. I mean, it's not a really impressive place. And he also, so we spent like 3 or 4 hours in this one conversation just meeting, the two of us and his interpreter. And he had this really disconcerting habit in mid-conversation of pausing and then staring up at the ceiling. And he would do this for 3 or 4 minutes at a time. So I'm trained as a diplomat to carry on conversations. So you don't quite know what to do with yourself. But fortunately, he was a flashy dresser. So on this one occasion, he was wearing what can only be described as a pajama top with the photographs of dead African dictators on it. So I would spend the 3 or 4 minutes while he's staring up at the ceiling trying to guess how many of them I could identify. And because he did it a lot in the conversation, I got pretty good by the end. But
you weren't looking for your photo.
No. And I also had a really hard time wearing pajamas after that. But I remember another occasion, you know, Gaddafi addresses the UN General Assembly in the fall of 2009, a few years later. And, you know, world leaders are supposed to speak for no more than 10 minutes. Gaddafi went on for 90 minutes. And he was at the podium, and he had all these, like, scraps of paper that kept falling off the podium, and he'd bend over to pick them up. And I still remember listening to the terrific Arabic language interpreter at the UN in that era. And I'm listening to him, and about 75 minutes in, you hear in Arabic, he says, "I can't take this anymore." And he took off his headset, and that was the end of the interpretation for the last 15 minutes. But the serious problem was, going back to the Arab Spring, is that I had no doubt but that Gaddafi meant what he said, you know, about exterminating oppositionists. There was no way Gaddafi was going to negotiate himself out of existence. You had the Arab League of all organizations, which never agrees on anything, calling on the UN Security Council of the United States to intervene militarily, partly because Gaddafi at one time or another had tried to off just about everybody around the Arab League table. You had and you had Arab partners like Jordan and the Emiratis volunteering to participate militarily. You had the British and French, Sarkozy and David Cameron champing at the bit to intervene. you had a UN Security Council resolution that the Russians allowed to go through authorizing the US of force. So it's a long way of saying it would have been hard for Obama not to intervene. What we got wrong were our medium-term assumptions about how hard it would be to restore order and security in Libya, without which you can't do anything. We overestimated the capacity of our European allies to do more in that regard. We underestimated the temptation of our Arab partners to immediately take sides in the civil war that broke out in Libya. And then came Benghazi, the deaths, the murders of 4 of my colleagues. One of the worst periods I ever had as a diplomat was I had been in Baghdad when that attack happened on a trip as deputy secretary, and came back through to pick up their bodies. So on this C-17 aircraft, 4 caskets with flags on them and me, flying back to Andrews Air Force Base. And that's when it's driven home to you, the sacrifices that your colleagues make, and a lot of the dangers and risks that are inescapable in diplomacy as well. So we got things wrong in Libya, and then of course Syria, the last of the cases I mentioned, which can only be described, I think, as a policy failure for the United States. I always had enormous empathy for President Obama's concern about getting dragged into another big military intervention, but especially with the cloud of Iraq 2003 hanging over American policy at that period. I do think, however, we got ends and means out of whack, which is the classic problem in statecraft. We set maximalist ends. Assad has to go, set red lines over the use of chemical weapons. And then our means were too incremental and too grudging. And I think that, probably undercut our ability to use, undercut our ability, I think, to improve our leverage to try to produce some kind of a better political pathway in Syria early on in the conflict when it might have still been possible to affect it.
And that's a key issue there. There's a lot of debate on that, whether or not in March of 2012, the Obama administration, if it took a more active role in Syria, if it would have affected the course of events there. Well, what's your take on it? I know it's hypothetical, but... Yeah,
it comes back to the point about moments we were talking about before. In the winter of 2012, 2013, the Russians came to us because they were nervous. Assad was losing altitude politically. He couldn't recruit conscripts to serve in the Syrian military. The Russians were nervous. He was nervous. I think that was a moment where arguably if we had been willing to do more to support what was then a largely moderate opposition, it wasn't going to produce a military solution. But I think it could have strengthened our leverage in a more serious diplomacy. But I couldn't sit here with a straight face and tell you that had we done X, Y, or Z, it was going to make a fundamental difference on that landscape. Because the reality was the Russians and the Iranians, the 2 principal backers of Bashar al-Assad, were always going to double down, no matter what we did. Because for them and for Assad, this was existential. He was never going to negotiate himself out of existence. And the playbook that he learned from his father, from Hafez al-Assad, was a pretty brutal one.
Absolutely. In terms of who's more preeminent in Syria today, conventional wisdom is that the Iranians play a more important role in Russia. Do you agree to that?
Yeah, I think the Iranians are on the ground. And I think they, more than anyone else, they saved Bashar al-Assad and saved their own position. The Russians, played a significant role. They can play a bigger role diplomatically just because they're sitting as permanent members of the UN Security Council. I think Putin, in a weird way, you have to give him credit because unlike our grudging and incremental application of American power, when he intervened in September of 2015, it was not a big military intervention. 3 dozen, combat aircraft from Russia, maybe 2 or at most 3,000 Russian boots on the ground. But he telescoped it in a way. He did it decisively in a way that kind of maximized the political and diplomatic impact for Russia. But I think the Iranians hold more of the cards in Syria. But I also think that Russian and Iranian agendas in Syria are not identical. Exactly. And so I think over time, again, there's a little bit of space for artful American diplomacy to play on that and try to widen the wedge over time.
Do you agree that we should keep the 2,000 troops in Syria?
Well, I don't know how many there are there now. I mean, I don't think we should kid ourselves. You know, we're dealing with some very unsentimental players in Bashar, as you well know, in the Russians and Iranians. So the notion that whether it's 400 or 2,000 American Special Operations Forces, as capable as they are going to push the Iranians out of Syria is wishful thinking. And you just got to be careful. Now, in the short term, it makes sense because it gives you some leverage in trying to de-escalate the situation, because one of the biggest dangers now is the spillover. And you can easily see a situation where you have Israelis and Iranian Quds Force elements banging into each other, Turks and Kurds. And so having a little bit of leverage temporarily, I think, helps American diplomacy.
You mentioned how deliberative President Obama was. He's sort of like a very intellectual president, if we could use that term. And I noted in your book, you say, at its Obama era peak, the National Security Council grew to a policy staff of 300 compared to just 60 in the Colin Powell NSC staff that you had served on more than 20 years before. And then you go on to talk about how this affected foreign policy formulation. It just made it more cumbersome.
It did. I mean, some of it's natural. I don't think you could go back to the size of, you know, Brent Scowcroft's NSC staff, which many people hold up as the gold standard for good reason, right, which was around 60 professional staff members, or Powell's NSC staff in the late 80s, on which I worked, right, around the same size. But, you know, given a couple of realities, first, after 9/11, the sort of counterterrorism campaign almost required that you have very high level, meaning National Security Council level coordination of some of those decisions. International economic issues became more and more central in national security policy making. So both of those factors meant that the staff would have to increase, but I would argue 300 is way too big. And the problem with that is you generally get really capable, well-motivated people on the NSC staff, you know, the best of career right, officers, as well as, you know, people who are political appointees, as a general rule. And so the temptation then has become not just coordinators, but operators. And, you know, that creates a lot of problems sometimes. And also, again, you know the State Department as well as anyone, we can tend to be very passive-aggressive in the State Department, and it brings this, you know, the over-centralization of decision-making brings out that passive-aggressive, because, you know, the State Department has a lot of incredibly innovative and entrepreneurial individual diplomats. As an institution, we're rarely accused of being too agile or too full of initiative. So it tends to make people feel, if you're not in on the takeoff, right, you feel less responsibility for the landing. And implementation, I learned over many years, is at least as important as the strategy. Absolutely. And if you have lousy implementation, and this kind of a system, I think, can read, you know, some of those kind of risks.
Absolutely. Chapter 8, you talk about the so-called Arab Spring. I call it the Arab Uprising because spring, fall, winter.
Yeah.
And when the short game intercedes, a very interesting chapter. And you say Arab autocracies had seemed alike in their surface stability, but in 2011, each revolt was unstable in its own way. They erupted in parallel, each casting its own shadow onto the others. I've called the Arab Spring, the Arab Uprising, a tectonic shift in the political landscape of the Middle East that we're still seeing the repercussions of. We've had the counter-revolution, the autocrats coming back, stifling a very popular uprising throughout the Middle East. And now we have Sudan and Algeria. So it's not ending. No. It's not ending at all. And just your take on how fundamental, do you agree that this is really a fundamental tendency in the Middle East that is like a continuing story?
Yeah, I mean, I think, sadly, I think the dysfunction that you see in the Middle East that produced the Arab uprisings beginning in 2011 is going to produce them again unless it's addressed, unless you have leaderships, and I know this is much easier said than done, but are willing to address some of those concerns. And that's why, you know, I understand the limits of agency for the United States. Mm-hmm. We have far less capacity than we often imagine, especially in this era, to reshape the Middle East. We've generally got ourselves in a lot of trouble when hubris has, you know, led us down that road. But, especially with our friends, authoritarian leaders in the Sunni Arab world, we need to be honest about this stuff, and we need to make it a two-way street. So, with regard to Saudi Arabia today, and Mohammed bin Salman, the, crown prince and effective ruler of Saudi Arabia, who does not lack for self-confidence, we ought to be strongly supportive of serious efforts at social and economic modernization. What he laid out in his very ambitious Vision 2030. We ought to be clear that we're going to support Saudi Arabia and our other friends against legitimate external threats, whether it's from the Iranians or anybody else. But it needs to be a two-way street. We should be very direct as friends when that leadership overreaches, whether it's domestic repression, like the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, a Saudi journalist who was the mildest critic of that regime that I can imagine, murdered in a Saudi diplomatic facility in Turkey. We should push back hard against that. We shouldn't indulge it. And the same is true with, external overreach, like in Yemen today. Where it seems to me the Saudis are helping to create not only a humanitarian catastrophe, but a strategic catastrophe too. It's costing billions of dollars, and that's a conflict that ought to end. And it's not beyond the capacity of diplomacy to try to help make that happen. But you need a Saudi leadership that's prepared to do that, just as you need an Iranian leadership that's prepared to engage as well. But that's a place where I think American diplomacy can make a difference. But it requires us to make two-way streets of some of those relationships, bearing in mind that they're going to become more brittle and unstable over time unless they address some of those domestic dysfunctions.
Well, talking about Iran, in your Chapter 9, you played a critical role in the negotiations that led to the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement with Iran. And you were involved in very secret diplomacy, and we know that Sultan Qaboos in Oman hosted some of your secret negotiations at the time with the Iranians. Can you give us a flavor of what it was to deal with the Iranians? I've always told, when I was heading NEA, I was telling our colleagues, I said, when we negotiate with the Iranians, I want everyone to have one hand on their wallet, because when they leave the room, the wallet will not be there.
Very tough.
But what was your take? Because you were really involved in one of the most consequential negotiations.
Well, you have to remember, we had gone 35 years without sustained diplomatic contact with the Iranians. So this was a minefield, and nobody had a really good map. There's a huge amount of grievance on both sides. We watched as 63 of our colleagues were killed in the embassy in Beirut in the spring of 1983, and then the Marine barracks, 240 Marines killed. Later that fall, another attack on our embassy. The Iranians' list of grievances is just as long. Truth is, we did put our thumb on the scales in the 1980s for Saddam against Iran. In a terrible war between Iraqis and Iranians that Saddam started in the 1980s. And, so the Iranians have a long bill of particulars. So there's a lot of baggage on both sides. I think I was always convinced, especially as I got to more senior positions in the State Department, that we needed to test, with our eyes wide open, the prospect against the backdrop of the war in Iraq in 2003 and our bitter experience with the use of force in the Middle East, that we could test whether diplomacy could produce a practical result. In this case, preventing the Iranians from developing a nuclear weapon. Wasn't going to solve the problem of Iran. Their behavior threatens our interests, threatens the interests of our friends in lots of different ways across the Middle East. But this was the most imminent risk, an unconstrained Iranian nuclear program. And so, beginning at the very end of the George W. Bush administration, and then much more ambitiously in the Obama administration, we set out to try to test that. Obama spent most of his first term, 2009 to the end of 2012, having demonstrated we were prepared to negotiate directly with the Iranians, to use that as an investment when the Iranians proved not to be serious about the negotiations, to use that as an investment in a much stronger international coalition and much tougher sanctions on Iran. So beginning of his second term, early 2013, it was no coincidence that the Iranian leadership's minds were focused. Their oil exports had dropped by 50%. The value of their currency had dropped by 50%. I think President Obama made the right decision, given the baggage on both sides, If we had tried to do this in the glare of public scrutiny at the start, we wouldn't have gotten very far. So we tried to do this quietly. The Omani government was a good facilitator. They were reliable. Oman was enough of an off-the-beaten-path place where even in this day and age, you could do things quietly. I think I had not taken a sick day in 20 years in the Foreign Service, and so all of a sudden I was sick on Fridays and Mondays. And we would take a 17-hour flight on an unmarked US government aircraft to Muscat in Oman, and then meet in this secluded Omani military officers' retreat on the Arabian Sea, where it was about 130 degrees Fahrenheit outside, so there wasn't much to do other than talk to the Iranians. But it became pretty clear, especially after Rouhani was elected president of Iran in June of 2013, that you could do a deal, and we had understood you weren't going to do one sweeping deal to resolve all of the problems between us and Iran, but you could do what we did in the interim deal, which was finally reached after 9 or 10 of these secret sessions over most of 2013.
That's a lot.
Some in Oman, some in Geneva, some actually on the west side of Manhattan, where on the Iranian side, 5 guys with white shirts buttoned all the way up and no ties could blend right in. So it was, but we made faster progress than I ever imagined. And we ended up with a reasonable agreement. It froze their program. It rolled it back in certain respects. We imposed very intrusive verification and monitoring procedures, all in return for that interim deal, the first step, very modest sanctions relief. We preserved most of that leverage for the comprehensive negotiations. Was it a perfect deal? No, but perfect's rarely on the menu in diplomacy. Was it the best of the available alternatives? To this day, I'm convinced it was. And that's why I think it was a big mistake to have abandoned that deal, a little more than a year ago, or almost a year ago now, simply because I think it creates a lot of collateral damage. Right. I think it undermines further our credibility because it comes against a pattern of retreat from international agreements. I think it widens the fissure between us and our European allies, in a sense doing Putin's work for him. I think it undermines the utility of sanctions over time because, you had even the foreign minister of Germany a year ago stand up and say, all of us need to reduce our vulnerability to the US financial system. This won't happen overnight, but we're going to wake up 5 or 6 years from now and find that sanctions, when we used it effectively, was a pretty good device, is going to be less effective. And not least, I think it's increasing the dangers of collisions, and the dangers of escalation at a time when I'm not entirely confident of the capacity of this administration, to manage those kind of escalations. We can do a lot of damage to the Iranian economy. I have no doubt that we are. But pressure for the sake of pressure, or if it's aimed at just producing either the capitulation of that regime or its implosion, I don't think that's tethered to history. I mean, I think you need to connect it to some hard-nosed but realistic set of aims. That's what I think we did in the Iranian nuclear agreements, and I hope that's what people are thinking about now in the administration, because otherwise I think we can end up with some collisions that aren't going to really benefit anybody.
Well, just yesterday, Javad Zarif said that if the Trump administration continues with enforcing more and more sanctions, that Iran will consider withdrawing from the NPT. A lot of people, whether this is an empty threat or not, but what bothers me is that what you achieved was a step toward nuclear nonproliferation in the Middle East, and we know the Saudis and the UAE are all going into these nuclear, civilian nuclear reactor deals. But once that dam is broken, you don't know where it'll end. So I agree with you. I mean, it could be a collision course. Well, the last question, you've answered. You're prescient. You answered the questions I have from the audience here, but there is one question about the future of the American diplomacy and the Foreign Service, and what the role of American diplomats will be in the future. Do you want to say a few words on that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, just very quickly. I mean, over those 3.5 decades as an American diplomat, I've never seen a moment when diplomacy mattered more to advancing American interests in the world, in the sense that we're not, as I said before, the singular dominant player in the international landscape. There's competition out there. But I still think we have a stronger hand to play. But diplomacy becomes, an essential tool in trying to do that, at least as our tool of first resort. It's not going to solve every problem. But, when it does work, you avoid enormous expense in blood and treasure that inevitably comes with the use of force. So I think it matters more than ever. I think it has to adapt. As I was saying before, the State Department, all of us can be a pretty stodgy organization. And, we need to delayer. I remember, one of my last months as the Deputy Secretary of State, the #2, getting a memo on the most mundane issue, and it was a half-page long, and attached to it, this will bring back memories, a page and a half of clearances. So every imaginable office in the State Department, and some that I had a hard time imagining, had pronounced on this. And the problem with that is it reduces any real sense of accountability, or pride of authorship, either for the prose or for the arguments that you're making. So there's things the State Department can do too. It's also going to have to modernize. I still think it's in this information technology age when there's an avalanche of information out there, you need people, ambassadors overseas, who can help distill that and answer the so what question. So what does this matter to American interests? How does this shape our choices? But you're also going to have to, modernize the State Department with skills and technology. In your generation, in mine, you had to be able to throw around terms like nuclear throw weights. I spent way too much time in the White House Situation Room as a senior State Department official, collectively faking it with a lot of smart people on issues like the geopolitics of data or how, artificial intelligence is going to, transform the international system. You need to bring people in with those skills and be flexible about how you do that. Same is true with regard to climate change. Same is true with regard to the increasing significance of economic issues as well. You need a political leadership that understands the significance of diplomacy and strikes the right kind of balance between military tools, economic tools, the power of our example, and diplomacy. And the last thing I'd say is, I think you need in the State Department and in political leadership to face up to the reality that, for all of my concerns about the current leadership in Washington, Donald Trump did not invent the drift in American diplomacy, in the last 10 or 20 years. And nor did he invent the disconnect between a lot of people like me, card-carrying members of the Washington establishment, and lots of American citizens who, in my experience, don't need to be persuaded of the importance of American engagement in the world. But when we preach the virtues of disciplined American leadership, they buy the leadership argument, but they're more skeptical on the disciplined part, because they've seen, evidence after evidence in administrations of both parties where we haven't always, matched ends to means, where we've overreached sometimes too. So we got to take that seriously, and we've got to, we all tell ourselves that smart American foreign policy begins at home, in a strong political and economic system, and that's very true.
Critical.
But it also ends there too, in more jobs, in better security, in a healthier environment. And we need to do a better job, including career people in the State Department, of making that argument to people. And there are lots of allies out there today. We tend to fixate on the US Congress, which is a pretty dysfunctional place these days, but there are lots of governors and mayors who appreciate those arguments and are increasingly active in international affairs. So there's natural allies out there, but we got to recognize that disconnect, because you're not going to have effective diplomacy unless we begin to narrow it.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's thank Bill Burns for a wonderful. Thank you, Bill. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.